the cedar splits, I offer sweat and splinter.
Kelly Moody here. Welcome to the Ground Shots podcast, a podcast that explores our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling. This episode of the podcast with Jason Hone, I wanted to go ahead and get out. I have been sitting on the episode for a month or two, partly because I was trying to find the right music for this conversation, and it's been harder than I thought it would be. This conversation with Jason is around the ethnobotanical history of the Holy Lands. A lot of what he goes into is the history of the Holy Lands in general, and why that history has influenced the land and what it looks like and how it's evolved over time, and why the conflicts and why the different movements and trade routes and events, rulers, just all the different things that have happened in the region, where right now we have a current tragic conflict unfolding between the state of Israel and Palestine. I was compelled to do this conversation with Jason because in the midst of feeling helpless to know what to do in response to this conflict, because no matter how much people say stop, we're like, what do we do? We're seeing all this death and destruction and horror online, and also being just someone from the Western world who has relative safety. I mean, it's a subjective concept, I guess. Safety, is anything ever really safe? But it's easy from a distance to just shout into the ethers online, like, stop, or do something different, or change this thing, or what are you doing? But I think I was compelled to respond by educating myself, and I knew that Jason knew a lot about the plants of this region. He's not from anywhere near this region that we talk about in the episode, so of course he's not gonna be speaking from his own deep ancestral tie to this place, which would sound different and look different. But I think his perspective is really unique because of how he knows what he knows and why. Growing up in Israel with his dad being a scholar at the university, teaching basically biblical archaeology is what I would call it. He calls it something else in this episode. I fully can't remember what he calls it, but basically he was the director of this department in the local university. And as a child growing up there, Jason got to be a part of the whole thing all the time. His father's research and teaching people to connect to the vast geography and history of this place and how the land is so intricately intertwined with the culture, despite whoever you are in that place. So I knew that Jason had had some relationship to this place growing up, based on meeting him this summer at a skills gathering where he was the first aid person, and we got to talking. I taught some wild tending classes, ethnobotany and ecology classes that had a lot of critical philosophy lenses, as I do when I teach these things, no matter what setting I'm in. And he and I struck up a lot of conversations about different plants and gathering seeds and planting seeds and gathering seed bundles and be just obsessed with plants in all different facets. And he would often refer to, well, this plant historically is used for this thing, and then I found out that he had a lot of knowledge of that region. He has a lot of varying perspectives to add, including super sciencey perspectives, as well as this is what the Quran says, this is what the Bible says about these particular plants, and it's a pretty interesting intersection of lenses. I wanted to get this episode out sooner because of the times we're in right now, and I almost feel kind of nervous right now. You would think that I'm nervous every time I record for the podcast, and sometimes I guess I am more nervous than other times. My podcast guests tend to be, and then they ease up, or some people tend to be. But I'm nervous just because, it feels like such a crazy time. Of course, I am horrified by what's happening in Palestine, and I have Jewish friends who feel very complicated about the conflict as well. And I can't claim to know or be an expert on the deep history of, or the deep traumas of any of this. It doesn't make genocide okay. It doesn't make murder okay, but none of the genocides and murder and like horrific things that have happened to any group of people has ever been okay. And I can't claim to be like the most educated person, but I'm trying to educate myself, and this is one way that I have been trying to, and it has changed my perspective on understanding how many different groups of people have found connection to this region because of the fact that geographically it's such a nexus point between worlds, and the trade routes has been for a very long time, maybe since humans have been humans. And because of those tradings and because of those movements, and we've had so much conflict in that area over time, and so many plants have moved through this region. And so the conversation around like what is a native plant is a big one for that area. Like it's kind of hard to distinguish that. I mean, it's interesting in this interview, he says that at one point bringing eucalyptus trees from Australia was considered improving the land, and like drying up the swamps was considered improving the land, and yet we would call that almost antithetical here in America, where bringing in a plant from far away that we thought was a good plant because it maybe was holding soil together for this reason or that, or fixing nitrogen or whatever, ends up being not acting the way we want, and then we're calling it aggressive and terrible and horrible. And so it's just interesting to hear that in another world far away, another region, the idea of where you would draw lines between what belongs where might be very difficult to do, but based on how much people have moved through a place over time, and based on cultural ideas of what it means to improve land, especially after hundreds, if not thousands of years of conflict, where sometimes the land became the battleground for hurting your enemy. And he'll talk about things like salting the earth in this episode, where basically the land in some areas were treeless and barren and lifeless for over 500 years as an act of war. So, wrapping it back around again, I wanted to get this episode out despite not finding the music that I wanted for this conversation, because no one was getting back to me. I wasn't sure how to feature the diversity of music that I really wanted to be also embracing of the diversity of cultures that ultimately call that place home and feel like that it is their homeland, and also feel connection to the land and landscape and plants and ecology of that place. And I had a few directions I had thought to go with the music, and I did reach out to quite a few people. And then there's a few more that I was going to reach out to, but I didn't want to feature their music unless I had like music from each sort of group that currently is, although it's so multi-layered and not so clear-cut, like what is a group, too. And I just love music. Obviously, I've been trying to put it on the podcast this whole time, and I didn't find a lot of really beautiful music during this process. But as someone who runs a podcast with little funding, I can't pay a lot of money for music. And some of the suggestions people made when I did a shout out on Instagram were music suggestions I would have had to probably find some rights to that would have cost me a lot of money, which I don't have for that kind of thing because I don't have grant money for this project. I don't have a lot of listener funding, but some. And so it was already hours I put in trying to think about music stuff, and I just didn't have the funding to try harder to continue to find the right music, basically. And because it would cost me likely to put the music on, and then because for me, I want to make sure I get permission from every single artist that I use their music for the podcast. I don't usually go on those websites to find like random music and buy the royalties for it, I will contact the musicians directly and then ask for their permission and offer to buy their album. That's the most I can really do right now with the funding that I have. So I'm going to be releasing this without any special music, unfortunately. I'm really bummed about that because I really wanted to have music from the Holy Lands, both older music, modern music, music from different groups and different languages like Arabic or Hebrew. And I just felt like, between people not getting back to me and then trying to figure out how to get the right royalties to legally do it without getting in trouble with the little funding that I have, I just couldn't do it. So for folks who were hoping for that and looking forward to that, I'm sorry I could not make that happen. And I didn't want to wait on this episode any longer, given that the current conflict is really still happening. The conversation has been lessening about it, but it's still happening. The future is very unknown. It's been a horrible thing to watch online. And sometimes I wonder about humanity and trauma and how much we pass that on to each other, based on our own want for safety or belonging, and that the macrocosm of this war and the many wars that occur on Earth between humans is a microcosm between our personal lives with each other. And in my own relationship with my own trauma, I think about like how viciously angry I have gotten at times and how uncomfortable I have felt with that anger. And I asked myself, what would drive me to react with anger, or from feeling betrayed, or from feeling like my cultural identity or ancestral identity in the past that's happened to my ancestors potentially warrants for me to act in a certain way in this day and time. These are all just questions I ask. I think deeply about a lot of these things. I haven't been commenting about it necessarily a ton on the podcast or online. I certainly have said some things, but my usual way is to let it sink in. I do write on Substack at times, and I haven't written a ton about this conflict because in some parts I'm just trying to educate myself right now too, like I've said. And I write a lot about grief and trauma right now anyways, as it is connected to ecology and landscapes and our relationship to land. And so here's me reconnecting to my roots in my work as it surrounds how culture and ecology are inseparable. It's a theme that kind of ultimately is what my whole project is about, but I'm not one to be put into a focus category, as you have probably noticed on the podcast and in my work in general with my teaching or my interests. I really, really hate that in some ways and how our world wants us to do that. I'm not just the plant person. I don't even really teach all about plants on the podcast fully. I let my guests do that to a degree, but maybe I will in the future. I am more interested in conversation around how culture and ecology intersect, and that can look a lot of ways. So I prefer to respond by figuring out how I can put out narratives in the world that maybe would plant seeds that I have no idea where they will go. I like to plant seeds. I like to gather seeds from plants, but I also like to think about seeds in these other ways. And so I think this conversation with Jason has been really important for me to re-listen to a bunch of times, and just was very pleasant to have. Jason is just a wealth of knowledge and is obviously very enthusiastic about history and plants in general and helping people with plants and their health. And even when I had an infection in my thumb recently from something, I had a splinter, went weird, and it's basically cellulitis or staph in my thumb. I was able to call him up, and he recommended right away, Japanese honeysuckle is what you should use for your thumb. It is the plant for infection in the way that you have it. And I was like, duh, Japanese honeysuckle. So Jason's just a really cool person to listen to. And, he has his perspective from his life experience and his father's education and library and all these things. And I welcome you to listen with note-taking. And he has a website for his clinic in Utah that he runs. It's basically like I don't know if it's like a general clinic where people can come in and do health stuff, but it's like a clinic which incorporates holistic healthcare stuff. And I will have that linked in the show notes for you so you can find him online. I'm going to read Jason's bio for you guys too before we get into this episode, and we'll do a little housekeeping before moving into it as well, just so you guys get a bigger idea of who he is. So Jason Hone practices as a holistic provider for patients of all walks of life. He has worked in various disciplines of healthcare since 1996, and his experiences include emergency and sports medicine, wilderness medicine, home health and hospice, and specialized pediatric care for children with medical frailties. Prior to becoming a nurse practitioner, Jason earned a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing at Ameritech College of Healthcare in Draper, Utah, and his Master's of Nursing and Family Nurse Practitioning through Frontier Nursing University in Kentucky. Jason was raised in Idaho and Israel and has lived in Utah for the past 11 years. When he is not working, he loves spending time with his wife, Christina, and their 7 kids, and he enjoys traveling, exploring, and loves practicing and teaching ancestral skills. He and his wife are the founders of the Cast Gene Foundation, working to promote knowledge of this rare genetic disorder faced by their youngest daughter. He maintains national certification and professional membership through the American Association of Nurse Practitioners, is a member of the American Holistic Nurses Association, and other associations as well. All right, y'all, before we get into this conversation, a few things that you can do to support the podcast. Buy seeds from Vibrant Earth Seeds. They're friends of mine who own a seed company in Southwest Colorado, and their seeds are Southwestern adapted or dry farming adapted seeds that are amazing and have been selected by them and people before them for a really long time. You can find them at vibrantearthseeds.com, and you can use GroundShots10 as a code when you check out, and you'll get 10% off your seed order, and I also get a kickback from your order. And now is the time to order seeds. Go check out and see what they have. They've got tons of different varieties up right now to peruse and order now. I've totally seen them in their mode of seed saving and sorting and it's pretty cool to see what a couple people are doing on a small scale. There's a few really awesome seed savers in this area, and it's been really neat to see their worlds when I can. So support them, their project, support the seeds, and support the Ground Shots podcast. Use GroundShots10 at checkout to get that discount. Another thing I'm going to shout out in this episode is Matt Richards' online high tanning courses through traditional tanners. Braintan.com is how you can get to them. Matt does basic bark tanning, hair on, and soft first dents classes on Zoom. Super cool. I've had a lot of friends do his classes. I am about to start one of them, even though I have been bark tanning for over a decade and doing all kinds of natural tanning work with skins for a while now. I've used Matt Richards' book along with other books and, of course, mentorship and teaching from friends and comrades over the years, but I am a geek about things and how craft intersects plants and ecology and land and history. So what Matt has been doing with his research and his skill sharing is really amazing, and I encourage you to go sign up for one of his classes if you're curious about natural tanning. Braintan.com. You can also get like hides from there that he's tanned in his studio tannery, all done with natural plant or like natural elements, plant material or elements. You can also get books and tools and stuff from his website, but his classes have become super popular, and I wanted to shout those out in specific to just share more that they have seemed to transform the world of people interested in tanning, and like feeling like it's made it more accessible for people to demystify some of these things. So braintan.com. I'm also doing a sale soon with a couple hides. I'm not a big production hide tanner or anything. I'm not selling them a ton. I actually really haven't sold them hardly at all over the years for a few reasons. One of them being just I wanted to hone in my skill, as I do with a lot of the crafts that I focus on, that for me is a part of like experiential ethnobotany. But I will be doing a sale soon, and buying a hide from me or anything that I'm putting up for sale related to hide craft helps support me greatly as a craftsperson, as a lifelong learner, and as someone running this podcast and needing funding for all of the things that surround it. So look out for that. I had initially thought I would have that all ready by January 13th, but that has not happened. So forgive me for some of the dates in the past few months of like thinking I can be in 3 people in one and saying something's going to be done or ready by a certain date, and I can't quite meet those goals as being just one person. I've got a fundraiser going between now and February 4th, my birthday, my 37th birthday. A fundraiser for the podcast. I am adding this in right before publishing this episode because I had a dream about doing a fundraiser for the podcast, because I've never officially done one in like a really specific way of like, hey, here's an opportunity for you to support on this occasion. So for my 37th birthday, I'm hoping to even just raise $1,500 for the podcast. If you feel compelled to donate and support the fundraiser, support this project and everything that I've offered and my collaborators have offered with this project since 2018, the GoFundMe link is in the show notes for this episode, and it'll be on my website as well. Also on my Instagram, you'll see it as well in the bio. I'll have it in many places for you to access. So if you are a fan, you've learned something, you've gotten information, inspiration from the podcast, consider supporting the $1,500 goal by February 4th to help contribute to the overhead and funding of this project. I'm going to be offering some classes and mentorship opportunities soon in the next year. I'm not going to announce right at this moment on the podcast the specifics yet, but just know that that's coming in person and online. So just be aware of that. If you're wanting to learn from me in some way, I definitely get a lot of emails and messages like people wanting certain knowledge or information from me, and so I'm trying to find the best way to share that isn't exhausting for me and feels like good reciprocity. And I've been taking a break from teaching lately, but I will be doing it again, so just stay tuned for what I do conjure and share with y'all. And one more thing before we get to this episode, I love Bookshop, and bookshop.org is the website. And I have the link in the show notes for my specific bookshop store, basically. You can buy books that I recommend, or you can buy a book for me that I will receive through the Bookshop account, and I also get a kickback for the podcast. Super cool. I've had people order me books. It's been really fun to receive them. And also, as I find rad books, both books that people on the podcast suggest that I've heard about and I really want to read, or that I see in the ethers that seem interesting and relevant to like our conversations on the podcast or current tendrils of how this podcast kind of intersects and webs out into the world. They're on there in the 2 different lists I have, both books I want to own and books that I'm listing as basically recommended books. Anything from Deborah Magpie Erling's work, who I originally read when I was on a Signal Fire residency years ago, Indigenous writer, who I've been very moved by her work. Got a couple of her books on there. Red Nation Rising, Octavia Butler books, super cool, Afrofuturism writing work that I think everyone should read. I've got Samuel Thayer's books on foraging on there. I've got Jimmy Carter's book on Palestine and many other books related to the conflict that we're going to be talking about in this episode, but in relationship to land and plants. Specifically in this episode, for the most part, we do get into the cultural conflict piece, but I have some of those kinds of books on the list as well. And a ton of other things, tons of plant books for all different regions, because I collect books from super specific regions. When I was traveling a lot, I have like books from the Great Plains, from a Great Basin area, or from California, from the Pacific Northwest, Inland Northwest, and deserts, Southern Appalachia. I've got books from all the regions, and I think that's a really cool way to really see what's happening more zoned in a place. So if you're the kind of geek I am, got that kind of stuff on there too. And I think that is all the housekeeping I have. Besides also mentioning my Substack on here, groundshots.substack.com. That's the last thing. You can listen to these episodes through Substack if you'd like, or you can listen directly from my website or from iTunes or Spotify, of your platform of choice. But my Substack also has writings and Ground Shots podcast episodes that are just for paid subscribers as well. And your support on Substack really helps encourage me to write, to share journal entries from the world that I am exploring and the research I'm exploring, and also enables me to continue this project, which has a journalistic element to it. And in the past, I have included a lot of photography and a lot of other types of media with my Ground Shots podcast episodes, and I would love to get back into that again. I think Substack is a really sweet way to share that. I wish it existed when I had first started this podcast. As far as I know, it didn't, because that was the idea I had behind it. And Substack is just a really collaborative platform that I've been enjoying. We're gonna stop here and get to this conversation. I've been really wanting to get it out to you guys because it's fascinating. What Jason has to share is fascinating and really cool and interesting, and also some of it's really intense because war and humans seem to have been together for a long time, and the land really, really is affected by war. And so I wanted to give voice to the land in this really unique way for this conversation. So I hope you enjoy listening, and don't forget to look at the show notes and support the podcast. And all right, y'all, happy listening. I've been bottling medicine today and doing all these plant things, and yeah.
All those plant things that we love.
Yeah. Was bottling calendula oil and chaparral oil and making yarrow wound powder. So, yeah.
Yeah, that wound powder is pretty important stuff. Makes a big difference.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's such a simple thing, and I'm like, I feel like people will probably appreciate just having it powdered and being able to get it for their first aid kits. So kind of thinking about stuff like that with it. But
Well, something that I taught to Nicola Pellion years ago was how to fill up those straws. Just a simple plastic straw. And to cut them into sections, and you seal off one end and pack the yarrow powder into there, and then seal the other end. And then when you need it, you just clip off one end and sprinkle it on the wound. Closes it right up.
that's such a good idea, because I've been cutting off, like when I'm doing some pump bottles for the chaparral oil, and I have to cut off the bottom part because they're too long, and I've been like, what do I do with these? I'm like, oh, I could probably, I don't know if I would sell those, but like for my own first aid kit, that's such a great idea. Like, because it's like it's like right then you need it, like single dose. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. Actually, when I first came up with the idea, it was, my family laughs because I use them as the guinea pigs. And I had started packing stuff into straws. So I'd originally seen somebody doing it with salt and pepper. And I was like, oh, I'm going to do that with yarrow powder for cuts. So it was like, yeah, got this. And so I packed some, I fine ground it like flour. I ran it through the grinder like you would for flour.
Yeah.
And got it just super perfect. And then I packed it into, I sealed up the end of one of the straws. It was a little bit bigger straw from a little bit wider straw from McDonald's.
Yeah.
And I'll like walk in there and, maybe take I think 3 or 4 straws.
Yeah.
Don't even buy anything. I just go pick up 3 or 4 straws. It's great. But then I'll cut them into, 2-inch sections, and you seal off one end using a pair of hemostats and a lighter.
Mm.
It's so easy. And then you just flip it around, and I used I made myself a little tiny funnel out of some paper, and then used a chopstick to
Oh, the
pack the
packaging.
powder and pack it in a little bit tighter. And then I filled up the straw, and then about 2 days later, my son was uh, peeling potatoes with a knife and sliced his finger pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
And I was all, oh, cool. Wait. They're all, cool. What do you mean cool? I'm like, it's cool. And I put it on there, and he's like, wait, it doesn't hurt anymore. And it instantly stopped, especially with it that fine. It just stopped it just momentarily.
Cool.
And from then on, it was a go-to for all of my bags. And one day I was filming with Tyler White from TJAC Survival. We were filming with Jose Amoeda and Nicole Appelli and a couple others at Rabbit Stick, actually. And Jose was showing us a modified version of the Paiute deadfall, and he slipped and cut his finger in the middle of filming. And he's like, well, crap, now we're going to have to stop. And I said, no, it's okay. I pulled it out and put some on his finger. It stops it instantly. He's like, oh, okay, I guess we can keep going.
You had one. You had it in your back pocket, or you carry a little first aid pouch with you?
Yeah, I'm weird. Yes, I usually have one on me or 2 or 3 on me. And anyway, then Nicole was like, okay, tell me about this. What did you do? How did you do that?
Yeah.
And so I gave her one and showed her. And anyway, she was like, that's the best idea. I'm going to use that idea. She made videos on it to help sell her books. It's great.
Oh, cool. That's super cool. I
But
mean, it's always good to find these shortcuts and tricks and like interesting ways to incorporate and like contain these plants in ways that we'll be able to actually use when the moment comes, I mean, I just
yeah,
have
that's a biggie.
that I'm putting mine in, and I do think about like somebody's going out into the wilderness, are they going to carry a big old tin of it, or they're more likely to carry a straw? So there you go.
Well, what's more is the straw is completely sealed. So you're not going to get any moisture in there. You're not going to get any clumping. The second you cut the end off with a knife, it's ready to pour, and you just pour it into the wound. And one of the worst times that I had to use it, I had been chopping for a long time, and I handmade a giant kukri that weighed 5.5 pounds. Okay. When I say giant, it was, 5.5 pounds, big kukri, 19-inch blade, big thing. I shouldn't have been chopping when I was tired, and I totally missed the log, and the thing flipped out of my hand and buried the point in my shin.
Oof.
Awesome. And it went right through my pants, right into my leg. And I reached down, grabbed the yarrow straw out of my pocket, cut the end off, reached down, pulled the kukri out of my leg, and just dumped the yarrow powder, put my leg up on the stump and just poured yarrow powder on it. It stopped the blood before it even reached my ankle.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's pretty fast. And I didn't get any infection, and everything went very smoothly with the healing, but still hurt, but
Yeah.
happens when we pull those wonderful tricks. So whatever.
Totally. Well, maybe we could start by you introducing yourself and your background with plants. I know that you use plants in multiple different ways in your life. And then what I'm curious to go into in this conversation, we can certainly talk about first aid and stuff like that too. But I know that you know a lot about herbs from the Holy Lands and their historical lineages and relationships and stuff. So I'd love to dive into that. So maybe in your introduction, you can also contextualize for people why you know about these things, or like how you came to be in relationship with this knowledge and these plants from this region. And then we'll go from there.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to. So, well, to start off, right now, I'm a nurse practitioner, and I've got a holistic practice in Provo, Utah. The name of my clinic is Whole Health Team, and we do our best to help people with nutrition and diet and by use of herbs and supplements and exercise and physical activities. I do my best to minimize the use of pharmaceuticals wherever possible and to get people off of them when possible. This has been kind of a lifelong passion of mine. So going way back to the very beginning, when I was 4 years old, I got my first assignment from my grandmother to go help weed the garden. And she had a big garden. It was massive. And she had survived the Great Depression. And so being able to grow stuff and have nice produce was very important to her all of the time. And when I was 4, I started noticing, hey, this plant smells just like spinach, which is growing right next to it. And she says, oh, that's lamb's quarters. You can eat it. And I was like, oh, okay. And what about this one? It's kind of slimy and hangs right next to the ground. Oh, that's purslane. Well, can you eat it? Oh, yeah, it tastes kind of lemony. You can totally eat it. And by the time I was 9, I had learned all the ones that she could tell me in the garden and had started purchasing books. I have just loved, I've studied plants my whole life, well enough so that, let me kind of back up there a little bit. When I was 10, we moved to Jerusalem, Israel. My dad's got a degree in biblical historical geography from the Jerusalem University College over there. And he made sure we learned that country inside out. He was the academic coordinator for the Brigham Young University Jerusalem Center over there and helped design all of their programs and was responsible for a whole lot of really amazing things tied into that. But because he was helping to guide every student group that came over and designed all of their programs and tour routes and everything, he made sure that we learned that country very, very well. But he also taught a class for 6 years over there called the Biblical Manners and Customs of the Ancient World. And he made sure that we participated in as much of that as possible with every group of students that came. So like if it was the season for making olive oil, we'd go help with the selection, cracking, crushing, pressing, the same way it was done anciently, and make olive oil. We helped with grape harvest, and we got to help make wine the way it was done anciently in both the 6-vat and 8-vat systems, where you get in there and tread the wine press, with your feet and do it. And we watched it through the fermentation process, and we took it all the way through. We went harvested clay from the hills and learned how it was used on a potter's wheel. And, we went through the whole refining process, a 2.5-week process or longer over there, depending on what clays you're working with and everything. But we did pretty much anything that you would find in a biblical record. We studied and got to participate in. We got to do camel treks across the desert with the Bedouins. We helped with archaeological digs. We spent time guiding some of the tour groups. Like by the time I was 11, if he was too busy, he'd say, okay, take him here, 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 and here. Okay. By the time I was 14, it was take him to these sites and tell them about this and this and this. Oh, okay. So, it's a different way to grow up. But that's where we spent all the school years, just learning. It was like drinking from a fire hydrant, But then during the summers, my mom wanted to make sure that we knew her family, so they'd ship us home to Salmon, Idaho. My grandparents raised cattle, and so we were busy, kept busy a lot, helping with the fences, digging ditches, and doing all the regular fun stuff that you get out there, plus working in the garden. And every chance I got, I was disappearing out to the river. My grandparents owned a pretty good section of land, and between them and other family, a very long section, several miles of river that were right there. And I would just go practice all of these plants that I had been reading about. I take some fishing supplies in a little, I had a little possibles bag because, I'd been reading all about the mountain men and all these explorers. So I had my little possibles bag with fishing stuff and some extra BBs for my BB gun and some different methods for starting fire. And I'd go out there and I'd harvest everything from cattail roots and whatever I found out there was what I ate. So, maybe the occasional bird that I might not want to name at the moment, but uh, there was a whole bunch of stuff. It was I'd catch fish and eat. It was whatever I could harvest out there. But with the plants, I was tapping into knowledge from a lot of the herbalists that were over in Israel and herbalists from England. And I found that a lot of the plants that were talked about in Western Europe were all over out there in the fields. And I was like, oh, look at this. This one's curly duck. Oh, look at this. Here's Plantago major. Here's, and reading and studying about them and incorporating them into use. So that when we moved back to the States just before I turned 18, I got accepted to BYU, and I started going to BYU while I was 17. And my second semester there, I decided to take a class just for fun and took a wilderness survival course. And 2 weeks into the course, or a week and a half, 2 weeks into the course, the instructor says, "Okay, Jason, you need to stay after. We need to talk." And I stayed after thinking, crap, what did I do now? And he's, all right, I want you to be my TA. You obviously know this material better than most people will know it in their entire life. I need you as my TA. I was like, oh, okay. So then I TA'd for him for a year. And since then, I've ended up teaching stuff about survival in plants and herb use for 30 years since then. Been a minute. Wow. Anyway, now as a practitioner, I have the opportunity to work with a lot of people. And, in our communities, especially in primitive skills communities, I'll find a lot of people who have been marginalized by Western medicine because they're using herbs or whatever. And a lot of times it's because traditional providers don't understand what the benefits of a lot of those plants are. And they're like, "Oh, you can't use that. That's gonna mess this up, or that's gonna hurt this." And I'm like, "Well, actually, okay, yeah, this does this, and this does this. We can totally work with that." But it's a matter of understanding the intercorrelations between a lot of what regular medicine uses as pharmaceuticals versus, say, a tincture, which really, if you break it down, is a pharmaceutical. You're doing an extract of a plant, and a lot of your pharmaceuticals are plant extracts. Even some of the big ones that we hate so much to talk about, like you get a lot of providers who are putting people on statin drugs, and we hear a lot of negative stuff about statin drugs because as an isolate, they're terrible, but we talk in natural medicine about the benefits of a lot of these mushrooms. And you go to something like oyster mushrooms and look at that. They've got lovastatin right in them. That's where they rip oyster mushrooms apart to harvest that. And then they create a synthetic version that's even more harmful. But oyster mushrooms by themselves, if you eat a little bit daily, has the same benefit as if you were taking a statin drug. So, I mean, that's the kind of medicine that we can talk about and delve into a lot. When it comes to the land of Israel and some of the plants and herbs and fruits and other things that are available over there, it's a very, very extensive, complex history, and one that always garners attention, both friendly and unfriendly, whenever anybody discusses it. So, we talk about the land, we give it lots of different names. Probably the best way to refer to it is as the Holy Land, because it's holy to everybody. Christians, Muslims, Jews, everybody considers that a holy place, even for those who are maybe more of other beliefs, like some of the more nature loving religions, we'll call them. It's, you're over there by the Fertile Crescent, and you're in an area that is deemed to be some of the first among all of the populated areas of the earth. And so calling it a holy land is a good way to do it. In Hebrew, they call it haaretz, the land, and it's a good way to refer to it. But there's so many different aspects to talk about there. So many fun things.
Yeah, when I was thinking about asking you about it and thinking like, what do I mean, especially with the conflict happening right now, obviously there's a lot of conversation about like the social political stuff and history and all these things. And I thought like, what could be really cool right now, and especially in this moment, is to like turn to the land itself and say, okay, what is the history of the land and the plant relations of that land, despite who's living there, right? And who claims it and all these different things. And then like me thinking about how to describe the place, like it's not the Middle East because the Middle East is a greater expansive region. It's the Holy Lands, like that's, so I said that earlier, and then you're elaborating on like why that's actually kind of the most appropriate way to describe the region, because kind of no matter who you ask, that's agreed upon, even if you don't even identify with any of these religions that are
Yeah.
have creation stories and have like history in the place. It is such a
Yeah. And
nexus of human history, right?
it absolutely is. History, philosophy, so many things in our world are shaped by what is currently taking, what has taken place. That's central to all history as we know it. It's impacted every nation on earth. And that's saying something, because it literally has. If you there's so many different things to look at, but the current conflict, you mentioned kind of setting the people aside, but if we address the people for just a moment, they all, it doesn't matter if you're talking Arab or Jew or whatever. Even a lot of us from other nations claim Abraham as a father.
Yeah.
And if you take a look at the history there, he had Ishmael, and he's the father of all these nations. Okay. And so Ishmael was the father of 12 princes of the Arab nations. And Abraham's third wife, Keturah, was the mother of 6 other ones, including the Midianites and Edomites. These are all important people who played a big history in that land. So it doesn't matter if you're looking Jew or Arab or whatever, all of these people really come from the same family. And whenever you had destructions, or, well, with the exceptions of when the Assyrians came in, then the peoples who remained in that land, yes, the Assyrians, Babylonians, others carted off, especially the royalty and the main bodies of people, but you still had people with the same blood left there, Jews, Arabs, all in the same country. So, another example of that would be in the Bible. It talks about how the Jews hated the Samaritans. Well, the Jews being referred to were those who had been taken to Babylon and then had come back. But you had the Jews who were left in the area, and a lot of those had mixed with some of the local blood and had become called Samaritans. It's talked about by somebody important in there in the New Testament about the animosity that existed between the Samaritans and the Jews. But realistically, they were all of the same blood. Just some had remained there and intermarried with other peoples who had remained there from even longer before. So really, when it comes right down to it, it's brother fighting brother. And so that's kind of sad. It's all based on philosophy, and we've seen that even here in American history, where we've had North and South and brother fighting brother and others. But it's common for us humans apparently to become so wrapped up in minutia that we overlook some of those bigger pictures. But now going back to the land, Haaretz, that the Holy Land there, it has an extensive history of destructions and rebuilding. And if you really delve into the history, which it takes a long time to do, I'm not going to lie. If you just try to go pull something up on Google, you won't be able to find this all in one place. And a lot of the sources that I know are sources that I've learned from my dad's rather extensive library. And a lot of those books are out of print. But if you start looking at what happened with each of the different, you read about the Bible, and it talks about how there were forests and how it was how the Holy Land was a land of milk and honey. And it talks about all the bountiful, stuff that was everywhere. And you look at what's over there today and you're like, it doesn't compute. How is that the same place? Well, to understand that, you kind of have to look at the histories. And so, we could go back to like the time of, the land of Canaan, way back before the Israelites came in. And, it was covered with forests and groves and all stuff like that. And the peoples of those times, um, a lot of fertility rites and other things, and they worshiped down in the groves. So they liked their forests, they liked those things, so they made sure that they were well cared for, and it was an abundant land. The Israelites came in about 1200-ish, and 1200-ish BC, and by the time they had conquered a bunch of that, the kingdom of David was 1000 BC. And even then it talks about how, there's a couple stories about David's army dealing with some of the forests and other things. Even his son, who had all the problems that he had a bunch of problems with, his hair getting caught in the branches of the forest as he drove through on his chariot. And it's there's stuff there. So he talks about how there were bears and other things. And we know from a lot of the descriptions that there were forests of oak and pistachio and pine, and a lot of mixed woods over there. And that varies by region. Israel is one of those unique places that in such a small area, what we call the current country of Israel, but that area right there, it encompasses, you've got, in 40-mile wide and 240 miles long, you've got almost every climatic type represented. You've got snow-capped mountains up in the north, you've got rainforest type areas, you've got desert areas, you've got a coastal plain, you've got the Shfela region, which is the low hill region, where you've got lots of agriculture and mixed woods. And I mean, you have a lot of variety in that small space. And so when you hear some of these descriptions, it's like, wait, what? How could they have that? But really, because of the varied geography, you go from that coastal plain up the low hills, and then you've got the high hills on top. And to top that all off, because of the location of that land, it was central between Europe and Africa and Asia. So all of the trade routes, the spice routes, the travel, everything went through there. And so that's why every major general, ruler, leader, nation, conqueror, all impacted that country. And because it was central to all of those routes. And I know you have a special affinity for what we here term as invasive plants. Israel has a wide variety of plants because you get them from everywhere. You've got plants that you get from Europe, you've got plants that you get from Asia, you've got plants that you get from Africa, and they're all right there. And the growing, the growing seasons are different all throughout those microclimes that you've got in the country. But you've got stuff growing year round. And so it can be a very lush area. But then that begs the question, why isn't it? So I'm going to go back to some of these destructions. So you had the establishment of King David's kingdom in 1000 BC, and then you had some divisions there 2 generations down after Solomon. His son split the kingdom. You had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and somewhere between 720 and 722 BC. I guess I should say that the other way around, 722 and 720 BC, because we're going another way. Then you had the Assyrians come in, and the Assyrians, while there was a lot of destruction of the land, they weren't like some of the other conquerors. They weren't about just trying to raise and destroy the land. They were after the people. And the Assyrians had a different theory about how to control their conquerings. They would pick up people and transport them to a new area and bring the people from that area and transport them to this other area. It was this cultural contamination, basically take them out of their element in order to control them better. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Um, so while there was some destruction to the land with the Assyrians, then it wasn't anything like what happened when the Babylonians came in 586 BC, and they razed, destroyed, just they cut down all of the trees, and the lumber was sent back to Babylon. They destroyed Jerusalem, and
And
you know,
Babylon
pretty,
is what's now is known as Syria, like that region, like between the Tigris and Euphrates. Am I correct?
yeah, yeah, yep. And you got to remember, we're referring to a bunch of these places by their ancient names,
Yeah.
but and without having a map in front of you to show where all those are, people might get a little bit lost in this. Suffice to say that the ancient kingdoms of Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, they still exist today. Iran is Persia, and people are like, "Oh, really? We didn't know that." Yeah, yeah, those are Persians. They speak their native language is Farsi. It's not Arabic. It's different. So all these things are kind of for a lot of our Western education focuses on just us and leaves out a lot of the rest of the world. And Middle Eastern history, Near Eastern history is crucial in understanding a lot about both us and the rest of the world. But anyway, going back here, so the Babylonian destruction, 586, they leveled much of those forests. They just decimated them. Any grove of cedars that they found were hauled off. I mean, they laid waste to the country so that it was not really too recognizable. You had At that time, you had some tribes that were living down in the Negev area, down in the desert, and they were already using very careful irrigation practices. The Nabateans and the Edomites, they were already doing that and growing things in the middle of the desert. Pretty cool. We're like, well, we're the only ones who can do that. They didn't have the technology. They very much had the technology, and they did great things. Um, then you had some, and so the Nabateans and the Edomites, they started growing stuff down there around 500-ish BC, and that continued clear up into the Byzantine period, which was, I think all the way until about 500 AD. So you've got agriculture in the Negev, in the desert, by those tribes up until then. Kind of cool. It's not really talked about. Um, but they kind of provided a backbone for supplies for lots of groups that rose and fell during that period. But they were providing food and support that really helped keep that land going. And then you move on to the Greeks, and when you had the Greeks come in, they they conquered stuff, but then they were all about beautifying it. They wanted to treat the land nice, so they planted gardens, and they did vineyards, and they did orchards, and they planted more groves and all kinds of stuff everywhere, and tried to make it beautiful. And really, that was kind of a golden era for Jerusalem and that whole area. Um, the Greeks built a lot of really fancy resorts all through that land. And you can go over and you can see the old baths, and you can see all these old, steam places where they go sit in the steam baths. And yeah, they had lots of parties in that country. They did. And like the whole Galilee, Golan region, all the way south. And so the Greeks treated the land all right. When the Romans came in, actually just before the Rome. Well, no, when the Romans came in, and they conquered it about 63 BC. So the Greeks were there a long time. Not quite 300 years, I think, and that changed the land a lot. Really beautified it. Did some good stuff. But then you had the Romans come in, and they were hardcore destroyers. They did a lot of stuff, and they did a lot of damage when they came in. Additionally, they implemented taxes on the trees on everybody's property.
Really?
Interesting. Yes. So you got taxed more for every tree you owned. And so interestingly, some trees disappeared. over time. Weird. They just sort of disappeared. And makes perfect sense. And you got to remember the Romans were there a long time. They were there a long time. And all of it was pretty damaging. They were very, very cruel to both, and it didn't matter what the people's origins were, they were cruel to everyone. They were treated subhuman. It didn't matter what their genealogy was. If you weren't Roman, you were lesser. And so Jew, Arab didn't matter. Um, then you move into, and you know, they weren't called Arabs at the time. That's a modern term. That was, you know, it was actually originally a derogatory term used in the 1800s and later. Now it's commonplace, but it was considered a derogatory term for a long time. But
And
all of those,
perhaps
yeah, all of,
overgeneralizing of like many different groups of many different people who come from different tribal like lineages, you know, like the overarching idea of what is Arabic, you know.
incredibly tribal people. In fact, the what we call the nationalistic idea of those nations didn't exist until after World War One. That was all tribal land. That was all tribal land. So, and you know, if you look at where some of the names for the different countries came from, clear back. So Hadrian, after the Jewish uprising in the 2nd century AD, he was so mad at all Jews of every kind that he struck the name of Jerusalem and struck the name of Judea from every map. He ordered it done. And they went back to calling the land Philistia and then Latinized it to Palestinia. But it was in direct response to the Jewish revolt, which I think was 167-ish AD. And yeah, in fact, they changed the name of Jerusalem to Alia. I can't remember the other, but it was Alia. And yeah, and because that was one of Hadrian's names. So basically, he named the city after himself. So you know, there's a lot there. But I know that when you and I had talked before, I had mentioned something about the salting of the earth and other things. So the Romans only salted 2 areas that we have very specific recorded history of that's been confirmed. One was the city of Carthage, you know, and the other was the city of Jerusalem. And when they destroyed that city in 70 AD, they leveled it so that not one stone stood upon another. It was completely leveled, and they salted the earth in the surrounding area to the point that the Temple Mount was completely barren for 500 years. It wasn't until the Muslim period that they started trying to clean it up and flush things out and grow things there.
So the
500 years it was barren.
so like
500.
it was full of forest before that. I know there was a sequence of things that happened, but like to make it to be that moment. But basically by the time the Romans got there and completely like poisoned it, basically, it remained. That's how long it is when salt's put on the earth. Like, I mean, not the level of what they did is probably immense, but that it made it so nothing could grow.
Nothing. The Temple Mount and that whole area, which had been some of the most beautiful in the country, and even, you know, you look at the writings of Josephus and others, he said that it was so devastating that anyone who had ever seen it before, when they looked upon it, wept for the destruction of the land. The Romans cut down every tree within and uprooted them and burned them within 10 miles of the city. Okay. Every tree, 10 miles. You figure that you've got Jerusalem, 5 miles away is Bethlehem, all this, you know, there's a lot of little towns and other stuff all through there. For 10 miles from Jerusalem, dirt.
Like, why though? Like, if they want to be
It
there,
was it was
live
to it
there.
was it was to crush them so that they could never be there again. The intent was to destroy them utterly. And you know, that's pretty harsh. That would fall under the terms of genocide that we hear about all the time. But that was what led to the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews through all the nations, was because they had to flee or they were dead. They had to hide their identities. They had to melt into whatever they could to escape. It was pretty terrible destruction that happened. And then, over the years and periods later, probably the greatest period for regrowth in that area was Suleiman the Magnificent. When we hear about him from the Crusades and other stuff like that, how he went in and defeated the Crusaders and took back Jerusalem. But you need to understand that, and we don't talk about this in Western history books, oddly enough, but a good portion of his troops were Christian. And they came in and ripped it away from the Templars and others who had taken control of Jerusalem and that area. And Suleiman the Magnificent was good to all of the people, and he helped to rebuild places of worship.
He was Christian.
He was good.
Christian or
He
Muslim?
was Muslim. He was Muslim.
But he had Christian people.
Half of his army was Christian. In fact, today, a lot of people don't know this, but in Syria, their cabinet's all split. It's Christian and Muslim, almost equal parts. We don't study that. We don't talk about that. Oh, we just assume, it's just a Muslim country, so we don't need to talk about it. We don't need to know how it goes. But no, realistically, there's a huge Christian influence there, and the Christians helped in battle to retake that area. They didn't like how it was being handled and how it was being run. And, it doesn't matter who's in power if the people in power are cruel and terrible. And the Christians who were in power during that time were basically stripping any Jew found of their wealth and taking whatever they wanted from any of the Arabs that were there, any of the Muslims that were there. And they just figured that they were God's people and everybody else was an infidel and deserved to die. Well, that's not what all Christians believed. And so the ones up in Syria, helped to fight to rectify the situation. But Suleiman the Magnificent helped to rebuild places of worship for the Jews, the Christians, helped to rebuild and repair the Temple Mount and all of that. And they started being able to grow things, repair, the land started to look good. Then you had you had a couple different exchanges there. And oddly enough, after him, you had taxes assessed on trees in the land. And then you had the Ottomans come in and conquer, I think 1517-ish. And they were there until 1917, exactly 400 years.
Wow.
And during that 400 years, they taxed all trees. So if you owned a tree, you paid for it.
So even until 1917, that was a thing.
1917, that is correct. But the Ottomans had put into place laws over the land. So the land, when they took it over, looked a lot different than it does today. And the land today looks a lot different than it did in, say, 1880s. 1884 is when the Jews started to migrate back to that area. And a bunch of the northern part of the country and a good portion of the coastal plain and the Jezreel Valley, that was all swamps. It was all swamps and marshes and mosquito laden with a lot of disease. And so in the 1880s, you had creative people, let me back up a little bit. The Ottomans had put into place that anytime you purchased land from someone, if you didn't improve it in 7 years, the land returned to the original owner. And so they would sell the land to people, and a lot of the long-term inhabitants, a lot of the Arab tribes and others who were there didn't improve on the land because it was all marsh, it was all swamp. And then in the 1880s, they had all of these immigrants come in and they're like, oh, we don't need to worry about them. Well, these immigrants didn't have anywhere else to go, so they had to make it livable. So they started improving the land. They brought in eucalyptus trees from Australia
Hmm.
to dry up the swamps. And all of a sudden, you had less disease. And you could plant and farm the land, and it was usable. And so they're like, well, we tried to live there. Like, yeah, but you didn't improve the land. And so their purchase is
Hmm.
what is valid because
Interesting.
they kept the contract. So they were able to keep a bunch of that land, and then it changed hands to the Brits in 1917, and they had it until they had ruling over that land until 1946, and so during that time there were a lot of repairs that were done to damaged cities and other things. It's kind of fun when you go to Jerusalem. Growing up there, we had to learn all the different layers of stone on the walls because you could see what different peoples had improved upon all these different levels, the top part being from the British rule. And so you're like, boom, 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 all these different layers. That city was destroyed like 26 times. So, it's a lot.
Wow.
But the Brits still had some unusual taxation, but they weren't taxing the trees at the time. So you did start to have a little bit of regrowth then. And because they were trying to encourage what the Jews were doing with reforesting some of the northern areas and making them livable, they didn't want to discourage that. So the taxations that were done by the Ottomans were completely on trees were completely cut down. Enjoy the pun there. But yeah, they so things started to build up and look better, and the Israelis started to be involved in planting trees all through the land, because in their scriptural records it talked about the land being a land of milk and honey and of forests and rich vegetation and beauty. So now we've got carobs and oaks and pistachios and date palms and olive vineyards, and you got stuff all over, and the country is much, much better than it has been for, millennia.
Mhm.
And this has spawned a little bit of the maybe not happiness, but it's also made the land much more prosperous. So where people didn't have food and they didn't have work, all of a sudden there's fields to work. All of a sudden there's banana groves that need to be tended, and there's date palms and pomegranates, and they're growing all seven fruits of the Bible over there. So and all of those peoples, it doesn't matter if they're Arab or Jew, view a bunch of the products of that land as religiously oriented medicine, if you will. For instance, in the Quran, it tells you to use honey and lemon for a sore throat. And they're adamant about that, and tells you to use a lot of teas and herb teas, and talks about their use and the benefit that they have for people. But then, and you look at the Jewish religion, and they start talking about how all of these different things are so important. You need to be using, those seven fruits of the Bible. And then you go into today's evidence-based practice, and it's like, oh wait, pomegranates, these things that they've been so big about for so long, cause reversal of cell aging. Wow. Okay. How? Oh, so you go into the fine details. Oh, look at that. Pomegranates are one of the highest sources of ellagic acid or ellagitannins, and those are converted in the body to urolithin A, which cause mitochondrial replication and the reverse aging of cells. Wait, what?
It's in the Bible, in the Quran. Hello.
It's in these ancient beliefs. They've known about it for a long time. So you can look at all of them. You look at the use of olives. You can look at figs or dates. All of those have place. So for instance, in Islam, if they're going to do Ramadan, how do they start their fast? They start their fast with a few dates before the sun rises, They go all day on their fast, and then they break their fast more. But the dates, what do those do for the body? Well, let's see here. We've got evidence-based practice showing that they help the body retain moisture. They contain tons of potassium and other electrolytes. They have all of these amazing properties. It's like, oh, so 3 dates can carry you for a whole day. Well, that's crazy, but it's scientifically backed by objective measures. It's like, wow. So a lot of the plants and fruits and herbs and healing practices actually help tie people together over there. And that's what I saw growing up over there. Most of the people that we interacted with in our very extreme way of being over there, we were spending time in Bedouin camps and going to Palestinian villages. And our friends in Jerusalem, we'd go to their house, and it was neighbors. It's just neighbors, and neighbors would have parties, and it didn't matter what they called themselves. They had parties. And one thing I will never forget was in 1992, we had what was recorded at the time as the heaviest snowfall the country had ever seen, to the point that we had snow at the Dead Sea. Yes, 1,300 feet below sea level.
Oh.
We had snow. The Sea of Galilee, which doesn't happen there, 700 feet below sea level. They had snow there. But we had 2 feet of snow in Jerusalem. And being something that they never had dealt with before, it was funny to see, because the roads over there, usually don't have that much cold or that much, icy stuff. So the cars couldn't handle it. And the roads were mostly tar. And so they're even slicker than our roads here under the ice. And you had Arab and Jew next to each other, pushing cars along the road. Everybody just helping everybody. It was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Thoughts of conflict were gone when everybody needed to come together to survive this crazy weather that had hit them.
Mm-hmm.
But being over there when I was, we saw good stuff and we saw hard stuff. We were there during the start of the first Intifada and into the second. And I remember when everything changed, when we went from being able to just go into any village and talk with people and be a part of it, to all of a sudden, if we tried to drive into a village and we had the wrong license plate, we were getting rocks thrown at us. If we went into the wrong part of town at the wrong part of day, we were in trouble. And it was very stark differences. You went from everybody was welcoming and kind to all of a sudden fences and rocks. So it's sad for me to see what's happening right now. I have friends on both sides of the current conflict over there. I've got one friend whose son was taken from his bed the morning of October 7th. And I've got other friends who were residing in the Gaza area. So I have some unique perspectives on what's going on over there, but I don't want to get too much more political on that.
I mean, I had no idea what your views are on it and were on it, but I just had this I don't know, feeling that it would be fine to talk to you about it, because it's precarious for me as someone running a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
With this current situations, supporting Palestine, then people think you're anti-Semitic, but then I obviously support the ancestral trauma that Jewish people have gone through, and knowing that it's so much more complex, and you've demonstrated that here in some ways by laying out some of the history, especially as it connects to the land, which is what I wanted to focus on in this. It's impossible to talk about land without talking about people, of course, and the complex ways that people weave together over time. And yeah, I was open to if that is where you wanted to go with it. And so I appreciate the perspective that you have shared, because I think for anybody on either side, I mean, of course, is it really two-sided? Not necessarily, but it's the way it's framed sometimes right now. A lot of people just don't know this kind of history and don't have a connection to that place directly or intimately, don't fully understand it, and haven't taken the time nor have the resources to take the time to dig deeper. And I think being reminded that the land itself is like an entity, it's like a being in its own right that has been there throughout all these changes and conflicts and people coming in and doing good things or bad things and leaving, like, has still been this being that's been there the whole time. And yeah, I just appreciate that kind of like perspective that you just have shared, even in like retelling some of this, because I think people who are listening can take what they want from it, and just like maybe in a way it's just like educational, and they can like add to their own like perspective, whether they feel adamantly one way or the other about the current scenario that's playing out. Um and yeah, I think for me, I've often just wondered about like what's happening to the land right now. I've heard about olive trees being cut down in an attempt to like disconnect Palestinian people from their olive groves that they've been tending, or like I've read some stuff about the prickly pear or like the cactus being something that Palestinian people have been tending for a long time, and yet they're really hard to pull up. Like it's not the same as being able to burn trees or cut trees down, because cactus are really spiny and like really hard to like destroy. And if you do destroy them, they might make more of themselves, you know. And so I've been hearing about some of these little tidbits here and there, and just wondering like, well, what's the deeper, bigger story, you know? And it's interesting that you lay out so much of the movement and corridor and so much of the energy that's like happened in this place of it. You know, we talked about invasive plant stuff at Elkhorn, and of course I know that's a contentious topic. That's like its whole other thing. But I think about in a region like that, what would you consider a native plant, or like a plant that belongs there or started there or like began there? And that is a similar question to ask about the people of like who belongs in that place too, right? Because anybody who's been through there and at one point in time has influenced it. So just like any plant that's brought through there has left an impact, whether it's still there in some way or whether the culture has been influenced by that plant moving through there. So I think,
Mhm.
yeah, there's a lot to all that for sure.
Yeah, there's so much going on, and I have to tell you, having grown up over there, and we'd get calls from family here in the States all the time while we were over there. They'd be like, "We heard that a bomb just went off in Jerusalem." We're like, no, actually, there was a bomb scare. Somebody forgot their backpack on the bus, and no biggie. Or we heard somebody got stabbed in the old city. No, nobody got stabbed. Somebody pulled a knife to try to rob somebody, and they were apprehended. Nobody was hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, those are completely different things. But then, you go back to say um, the, well, let's see here, go back to 1991 when we had the first Gulf War. And we were in Israel when Saddam Hussein started throwing missiles over, throwing Scud missiles at Israel. And we all received our gas masks, and we all received the atropine auto injectors in case we needed them. And we had a lot of times during those first couple of weeks of the air raids where we had to spend up to 36 hours in a sealed room, breathing through a straw. Super awesome. I so loved it. But we ended up being shipped out. The American embassy was like, okay, all non-essentials, you're gone. So we were out of there. We came back to the States, and they were saying things on there that we were like, wait, what? Because I still remember the first night of those air raids, and we had the sirens going off, went to our sealed rooms, and we ended up having a couple impacts. We could hear the Scud missiles coming over, and we ended up having a couple impacts that hit between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And they sent 2 groups of IDF forces out to both of those sites. They were in full hazmat gear. There were a combination of chemical and biological weapons that had been used, and all 84 troops at both sites died. All 84. But back here in the States, they were saying, there's no WMDs, there's no, and I was like, excuse me? I mean, I was 16 and I was like, that's not true. And I've seen a lot of that. I've got friends over there right now. I've had, close interactions with that land for, a long time now, longer than I want to say. It's scary. I'm like approaching 50 at this point. It's weird. But yeah, since I was 10, I've had strong connections over there. And a lot of what gets reported here is very biased, and doesn't matter which way you're talking, it's biased one way or the other. There's always an agenda with our media, and it very rarely, if ever, reflects the truth of what's happening in that land. And that makes it very difficult for me to watch any news. If I ever have any questions, I'm like, hey, so what's happening? How are you doing? It's a different, it's sad what we have allowed to happen here in our news and broadcasting and everything else. It's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah, totally.
So a lot of people get hurt by that. That whole land, the majority of the people want to just exist, and they're fine to work alongside each other. They're happy with it. You just get those fanaticals in each group that get all the media time, just like here. The moms and dads who take their kids to school every day and go work, they don't get the media time. We get the weird psychos who go hurt people and kill people and hog up tons of political baloney. We don't get the everyday stories. We don't know what the lives of most of the people in this country are. We only hear the crap. And it's the same thing for that land. We're hearing the garbage, and we're hearing the garbage through a magnifying glass that's painted with distortions that are hard to see through. So there are hard things happening on both sides of that conflict, and my heart goes out to everyone who's hurt. Everyone who hasn't created part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Do I think that there's a lot of other very important aspects to that? I do. Yeah. And again, I don't want to get into that on your podcast, but suffice to say, I think that if people go back to remembering some of the important things that bring us together, and we manage to somehow combine the majority of people who, I believe the majority want what's good. I still believe that. Maybe it's an old-fashioned notion, but I still believe that the majority of people will choose peace and goodness over this kind of nastiness. Yeah. And I think if we can get back to that and get rid of the problem causers, that's great. So,
yeah. I think about like coming back to the land as a commonality, like you just speaking to the diversity of ecoregions and ecosystems and like nooks and crannies in the region, and all the diversity of life and the food and medicine that's come out of that. And
yeah,
as a commonality between anyone who finds that place home, like the spices used or the different as like herbs, like spices used, like cumin and mustard and thyme, and like some of these herbs that have hyssop that have been in that region for a long time. That whether you're Jewish or Palestinian or anywhere in between, there's so much that can bring people together in what is common in that way because of the land, no matter what's happened to it. Right.
That's correct. I mean, you've got people going out, so Israel that whole area, that whole Holy Land, is a lot of their money is by tourism, because people make pilgrimages or want to go see it, go tour the country. And it doesn't matter for what reason. It can be religious based, or just because they want to understand the history. But the history is so dense over there. I mean, and you start looking at the plants and the food is part of the history. Is so awesome. I love the food over there. I hate American food, by the way, but I love I love the food over there. So, like you were mentioning, some of those spices, and it's things that they've used for millennia, and a lot of their remedies and other things we've actually completely lost. For instance, during the time of the Crusaders, the Arabs had knowledge of how to take a broken bone, a compound fracture, and heal a man's leg so that he was able to bear armor in 6 days. Okay. That's recorded multiple times in multiple places. Apparently, some of that knowledge still exists with some of the more remote Bedouin tribes, but they won't share it. They keep it very locked away. But they're herbal poultices and remedies. So if you can understand a little bit about some of those, you're like, well, it probably includes some of this, and it probably includes some of this. I'm sure you're speculating in your mind right now. I'll bet you there's some yarrow and comfrey and some of these other things. And you're probably right. But that land, to give you an idea of what you see in a typical year when you're looking at across the Judean hills, if you were to go in the summer, everything is, let's see, it's about this color, the whole ground, and there's like a little bit of grass and not very much vegetation. But the rainy seasons, when they start, so that country receives in 90 days as much rain as London, England gets in a year. Contemplate that for a minute. That's a little bit of rain. And those barren hills all of a sudden have grasses that are knee high, and within a couple of weeks you've got blossoms. So the whole thing is yellows and reds and oranges all across those hills, and it's knee deep. And that'll last, so if you were looking for a good time to go be able to see that, May is a good time to do that. And it is absolutely beautiful. And then June hits, and the end of June-ish, you start to get the Hamseen, the hot winds that come in off of the desert. And within 4 hours, no joke, we timed it. We took pictures. Within 4 hours of that hot wind, it's like turning a blow dryer on a fresh flower. And it literally lays down and withers up and blows away. 4 hours. And so you think about that. If the ground is that fertile, if that had still been covered with trees through that whole area, just what that would be like, because it would be a different scene. And they've planted a lot. There are some mixed pines, and they're planting a bunch of the native species there. They're trying to cut back and control the
eucalyptus
which is almost impossible, because those root systems are hundreds of feet long, and trying to get them out, it's just not possible. But they're trying to cut that back, because now they're like, oh well, we still need that water, we could use it, we could put it here or here. But those eucalyptus are just draining everything up there. And they took in some other invasive species of trees and things that they're just like, okay, so these weren't here, we want the real stuff that was here. And so there's a big movement to try to do that, and both sides have contributed to that a lot.
Like some of the original forest species that got cut down a long time ago
by
the Romans, and before the Romans.
The Babylonians, the Romans, all through those different periods. Any of the really terrible destructions. And so, maybe sometime we'll get to see all of that forested again. But
Some of these plants take so long.
Yeah, they do.
And I asked you when I met you in at Elkhorn, that's the skills gathering that I think that's where I originally met you. Maybe
Mhm.
we've been
Yeah,
at some
yeah.
of the same gatherings in the past before that, but
Sounds like we may have been, yeah.
yeah. Um I was like, oh, you might be the perfect person to ask more about the cedars of Lebanon, as someone
Oh,
who
yeah.
teaches about ethnobotany, and I taught classes on the ethnobotany of juniper, and it's one of those things where the word cedar has an etymological history, and in the United States, as we have used that word commonly to talk about different plants, trees that are evergreen, cone bearing, usually in the cypress plant family, can include any number of different species, but the original cedars of Lebanon are actual trees in that region. And you told me a little bit about that and how you visited the grove, and like, I mean,
Yeah.
I've studied a little bit the whole story of Gilgamesh, and like, I guess is that Sumerian or Babylonian? Maybe both. Story
Sumerian.
Sumerian, the
Sumerian originally, yeah.
original, so the like pre-Babylonian, but then it kind of probably was somewhat in Babylonian stories too. But um, which is cedrus trees, um, are what they are. I guess that's the genus, are not like, yeah, they're like a genus of trees that don't grow in the wild in the United States. And I think
Nope.
about like that grove that still does exist, and wonder about war at this moment and in the future, and just I'm hearing about like Lebanon might be like a place of conflict soon. I don't know. Who knows what the future brings? I'm just like, my immediate thought was like, what about the trees? Like the
Well, Lebanon has been a hotbed for a long time, but
yeah,
anciently it was like the capital of all banking. So
interesting.
no, people don't really know that anymore. But Lebanon used to be this center for all of the banking, for all of the trade routes.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a big deal. But yes, so biblically, the cedars of Lebanon had a lot of symbology. They were a reference for pride and other things. And medicinally, for the cleansing of a leper, you had to have a symbol of pride and a symbol of humility.
Mm.
And the symbol for pride was the cedar. And so you had to have a branch of cedar of Lebanon, and then you also had to, a sprig of it anyway, and you had to have a sprig from the humblest of all wooded plants, and that was referred to as hyssop. And we know from looking at some of the um, you can look at some of the chemical constituents in those, and both of them have very, very, very amazing stuff. That, oh, look at that, it's antimicrobial. It's oh wow, it'll kill that kind of bug. Oh yeah, it will. Like for instance, on hyssop, you've got rosmarinic acids, all the stuff from mint, all the stuff from some of the stuff from rose, some of the stuff from rosemary. It's you got all these amazing constituents in one little tiny plant, and it's like, oh, well, that's kind of cool. Like, how's it being used? Well, let's see. It's used in a lot of food recipes because the Bedouins and Palestinians and others will go out and harvest it in the spring when it's all nice and fresh, and grind it up to make za'atar.
Mm.
Or za'atar is basically ground hyssop with a little bit of salt and a little bit of sumac.
Mm.
And it is heavenly. It's one of my favorite things in the whole world. So yeah. But it's, hyssop, if you start digging into some of its properties, it's very, very powerful stuff. It's great for medicine. It'll fix a sore throat. It'll help with stomach cramps. It does so many things. Not quite to the point you'd call it a panacea, but it's up there.
The
And
medicinal herb farm that I was living on this summer, Matt
mhm.
Springer's farm, Great Owl Gardens. He comes to winter count, but he's not like, he doesn't, you might not have ever met him. He grew a lot of I mean, he grows a lot of variety of herbs there. But a lot of culinaries too, in addition to lots of other herbs that are hard to grow in different realms. But he has a huge patch of hyssop there, and I haven't like grown it myself ever before or really gotten to like spend a lot of time with it, but I tried a bunch this summer, being on that farm. And then he was telling me recently, like, this would be a great addition to a warming tea for colds because we've been coming up with some tea blends and stuff from some of his herbs. And so I've just gotten to like weed that patch of hyssop. It was a pretty big patch of hyssop this summer, and like kind of be around that plant more and the really unique aroma, kind of
Hmm.
sweet and savory at the same time, and like
Yeah.
some really intense essential oils that feel very complex, and I'm like, oh, what a cool plant. And like um I wonder, like, thinking about like what does a hyssop look like if it's in the wild, like where does it even exist anywhere like that now,
Yep. The Judean Hills, you can go out there in the spring and it's everywhere.
so cool.
And yeah, I actually have some that somehow managed to come back into my garden here. And I've got a whole row of it from that was started from this stuff over there.
Oh, I think
And
you told me about that. You brought seed back or something. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, cool.
But I've got it, it came up really, really well. I've got a whole, I've got a nice big row of it in my garden that's just hyssop. And, and then I pulled sections of it off and planted it in my front herb gardens. And, yeah, I love that plant. I don't think I could ever grow enough for myself because I use it so I use it on everything. I make Saptar and use it on everything.
Hmm.
And,
And hyssop is mentioned in both the Bible and the Quran, right? Like
yes, it is.
literally in scripture. That's
Yeah,
so
it
cool.
is.
Wow.
Yep, it is. It's mentioned in both places. Really, if you start looking at some of the if you really understand what's in some of the Quran, for instance, um, it's a lot of it. If you've never read it or never taken the time to see anything about it, or looked at the Talmud or what's in that, um, there's a lot of references for how to be healthy using plants. A lot of them, because realistically, one of the things, if you want people to, if you're really concerned about people to the point that you're going to write a record of that kind, it's because you care about them, not just spiritually, but temporally as well, so that there's more aspects to it than just trying to save somebody's soul. It's also trying to save them here. I i have to tell you that the food over there and the spices, you mentioned cumin. What do we see about cumin in today's world here? I mean, it's been used as a spice over there for a long time
We
for
think of it as
healing.
digestive aid, I guess, for gas and being able to assimilate nutrients, right? I guess that's what I think of, but
Yes. Okay. So let me expand that just a little bit. Have you heard the people talking about black seed oil?
a
That's
little bit.
black. That's black cumin, and cumin is powerfully anti-inflammatory. It's anti-tumoral. It's it's got all of these metabolic balancing effects. It's an amazing thing, and it's been used as a food and promoted for healing through all of those cultures for millennia. You know, millennia,
Well,
and
where is its origin? I know it's in the carrot family. I'm just like, is it Egypt? Is it the Holy Lands, or is
it's
it?
I actually, so my feeling is that it's actually a little bit more Asia, and then was brought over more to the Near East, so that I think it was more like India and that area where
Oh,
it originated, and
interesting.
then but now it's been so heavily planted all over everywhere there that it'd be a little bit hard to identify for sure. But um, I kind of feel it probably came from further east. But all of those cultures, all those tribal cultures, doesn't matter which one you're looking at, has incorporated it, and for healing and health reasons. Or you could look at frankincense. We use it here, sell the oil and the incense and all the other stuff with frankincense in it. But look what its uses are. I mean, today we can use it for everything from killing infections to reducing inflammation in joints to increasing testosterone. There you go. Probably didn't know that one. But it say a guy wants to boost his testosterone naturally, he can apply a couple of drops of frankincense to his feet every day. It'll boost his testosterone by up to 100 points in about 3 months.
Wow.
Oh darn. Shucks. Um, all these are ancient medicines, and they were used in everyday life. They were part of their culture, part of their beliefs, and we overlook a lot of that when we get to these big conflicts. But they're still a part of life over there.
Mm-hmm.
So
I was thinking of alliums too, like onions, garlic, and leeks and things like that as also another I think big one in that region as well.
Yeah, heavily used all over the place over there. Well, they're easy to grow, and once you get them started, they'll just keep going.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, especially like with the green onions and stuff like that, the Egyptian walking onions are very famous, but the other onions and garlic and everything, once you get them going, they just go. And so, yeah, those are heavily used over there. It's a very important spice. It's antimicrobial, helps with the preservation of meat, helps with the preservation of whatever they put it in so the food wouldn't go bad. They used it for colds and flus, and it's talked about as a medicine in all of those historical books we talked about also. And you go back to Egyptian writings, and you go back to so like it might sound funny, but even Cleopatra was actually quite the herbalist and scientist, and she used to do experiments with all that stuff. And we've lost most of her records because they were burned in Alexandria, but we've got all these other people who wrote, Pliny, others who referenced all these ancient works from the Middle East, from Egypt, from Jerusalem, from all these other places. And it's sad how much we've lost of that knowledge, or how much we're starting to regain some of that knowledge. But all of the generations that have gone by missing what some of those benefits are. And so that's why I love this kind of stuff, because we can talk about it and bring some of it out there. People are like, wait, we can do that. Oh, that's cool.
I feel like this is something that we could talk. I have like so many more plans, but I know we're about almost at time, and you gotta go home, and I got stuff too. But like, there's just so many realms. Like we could talk about figs for probably hours, and like cinnamon and calamus and all these herbs. But one more I would love for you to just like say if you have any thoughts on before we wrap up is you hear the words balm of Gilead mentioned. People often refer to balm of Gilead in the United States or in Western medicine as sometimes it's referred to as cottonwood buds or the resin of cottonwood coming from cottonwood buds, but sometimes I hear people talk about it in reference to what do you call it? Propolis from bee hives, which contains different tree resins, including cottonwood buds. But its original origin has biblical roots. I mean, it's in the Bible,
Correct.
I think, right? The word balm and the word Gilead have like whole realms that
Yeah.
have
So if you
nothing
look,
to do with cottonwood. And so maybe you could people don't know about this and they just say
well,
this over and over. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like what that.
well, cottonwood specifically is more of just a common name for something that we have here, but poplars grow the world over, and when you have an area, like ancient Gilead, that had water and stuff like that, you're going to have those trees. And poplars love water. We know this, everybody knows this. But yes, it does actually reference that very thing. And if you start looking at the finer constituents that come from poplar resin in those buds, which it's all sticky and it's just comes on your hands. It smells wonderful, but you can't get it off, and it definitely leaves a color on your fingers. You're like, yeah. Have you done that before?
Oh yeah, I love cottonwood bud medicine. Yeah.
But because of its sweet smell, so you've got to remember that back then scents were everything, and that's why the spice trade was such a big deal. That's why, that those trade routes were so important. And if you refined a product to the point that it gave this amazing aroma and happened to be anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial, anti-tumoral, and fixed pretty much everything, they figured that they could apply it to. It corrected systems. It returned the body to homeostasis, and it corrected any problems. Then it was considered almost magical. And we still kind of do that today with some things. We start off by talking about yarrow. There's a plant that can be combined with almost any herb and enhance its function. You don't have a lot of herbs that you can combine with everything. Yarrow is one of the very few. And balm of Gilead is one of those extracts from poplar buds that was more refined than what we make it today, I'm sure, than what most people make it today anyway. But because of the fragrance and the function, it was highly prized, and it made it worth its weight in gold. Actually, it was worth more than gold by a lot. And similar to Tulsi. Tulsi was also considered incredibly valuable. In fact, the Crusaders are the ones who renamed Tulsi Holy Basil, because it healed every ailment that they ever encountered. They talk about how if somebody had battle fatigue, basically PTSD problems, they could use it to calm the mind. And they talk about how it would heal diarrhea and improve all conditions. It says right in their records that they believed that it was sent of God to heal any injury or illness of man. And so, balm of Gilead was of a similar nature, but even more venerated would be the word, I think, by the cultures in that Near Eastern area. Just like Tulsi is considered one of the most sacred plants of Ayurvedic medicine, balm of Gilead was considered one of the most sacred, valuable healing substances that you could have in the ancient Near East. So,
Also, the word balm used to describe a couple different plants that had resin that had aroma, like from different, not just poplars, but balms were basically resinous compounds that had medicinal properties, and there was a perfume element and all this stuff.
Yes, when they're referring to the balms in that context, it's a mix between an oil and a lotion. So it's more liquid than a lotion, more viscous than an oil. So it's like, in the middle. But they had a lot of stuff that was categorized as a balm. And if you study some of the older texts from Syria and that area, and some of the older, what do you call them, the alchemy stuff, they describe some of those different terms a little bit better, and how some of them were used. Also remember that when we're reading balm of Gilead in the Bible, we're reading someone's interpretation of what the original description of that essence was. So if a scribe says, well, I don't really know what this other term is, what's the closest thing to it? Well, we'll call it a balm.
Right. Interesting. Translation.
A lot is lost in translation, and it's not just a joke. But yeah, kind of remember that in there too. But the writing about the balm of Gilead, about how it is so healing to the body and to the soul. It's considered soothing in every nature, and it has an effect. It's got sesquiterpenes and all kinds of other stuff in there, so it does calm the limbic system and help with neurotransmitters. But it's got all of these other properties in there. You have alagitannins, you have some of these other things in there that are so incredibly healing to the body. So applied topically, it's incredible. It was an amazing stuff. I guess it was, like their magic potion. So
Well, do you have any place online if anybody wanted to reach out to you and connect with you after hearing this, that you have like a website or any access point out there
yeah.
in the world? I mean, we can also put it in the show notes, but if you want to shout it out right now here at the end.
Yeah. So we actually have a webpage for my clinic, and you can send emails to the front.office@wholehealthteam.com, or our website is www.wholehealthteam.com. And super complicated there. It's just really long. But WHT was already taken, so out of luck.
Mhm.
But I'd love to hear from anybody. I love that land over there. It was my home for 7 years, and a lot of that, because those were such formative years, it still really feels like home to me in a lot of ways. And it really is quite painful to see some of the damage and some of the other stuff that's been done to that land. And I just miss the way it was. And
Yeah.
I guess that's the thing about adding birthdays. Everything changes.
Mm-hmm. Have you been back in a while to that region?
Last time I was there was 5 years ago. So, well, let's see. No, 2019. So 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably
Yep.
it's interesting to be having had the experience that you've had and be in the region where you are, and like not many people probably understand what you understand about it.
Yeah, being a third coaster kid, you get used to that sort of thing. And it does make a little bit difficult, because you never quite fit in with those who've never left this state. And it's interesting.
Yeah, totally.
You know what I'm talking about. You've traveled around a bit, and you
Totally.
have yeah. So you understand the world a little different. So when you go home,
Yeah.
your worldviews are slightly different than what you find in an isolated community.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Well, thanks for taking the time. I'm sure you're busy helping people out at the clinic, and thanks for taking the time to chat with me. I'm got a lot to think about with this conversation, and lots of things, just lots of visual. You painted a lot of pictures that I felt like I could imagine in my head, and I was just like so enraptured by so many of the stories you're sharing. So I'm really grateful that you took the time to share some of your knowledge and perspective, and I think it'll definitely add something to the podcast, and also add perspective, hopefully, to what's happening in the world right now. And just super grateful that you took the time.
Well, thanks for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to come chat with you. Kind of a general prayer out there that we can come to a rapid and beneficial conclusion to all of the conflict. I know other stuff may happen, but we can always hope.
Yep.
No, not me. Some may fear your appetite, but I'm at home in your life. Fiery fingers curling round, flaming tongues that flutter. Promise you will warm my bed. I'll satisfy your hunger. If you burn, burn with the light of the morning's birth. Burn, burn with the heat at the heart of the earth.
Theme music for the podcast is by Mother Marrow. Support the podcast by buying seeds at vibrantearthseeds.com. Southwest adapted or desert climate adapted seeds grown in the Four Corners region. So you can support them and me using the discount code GroundShots10 at checkout. You get 10% off, we get a kickback, and you support the seed company. You can also support the podcast by buying a book on bookshop.org through our store, and buying books through my bookshop account will get me a kickback too for the podcast. Sign up for hide tanning classes online with traditional tanners, Matt Richards, braintan.com. He offers a couple different types of hide tanning classes, basics, hair-on, soft versus dense. The classes come with a kit so you can actually tan at home and tune into the Zoom classes where you learn. I've been tanning for a long time. I'm about to take one of the classes, but I have used Matt Richards' book for many years along with other resources to learn to tan. Really excited about what he's doing. There's tons of other hide tanners out there too who are making it more accessible to learn the skill, and it's really neat to see someone who's been tanning for so long offer it up this way online. So go check it out, braintan.com. With that, let's go ahead and end this podcast episode. Thanks for listening, y'all.
Logs of locust cedar splits, I offer sweat and splinters. Forest elders breathe their last, I'll bring them for your supper. Every piece of wood I bring carries a story in lichen, fungus, beetles, maze. It's the same to you. Oh,